Dear students, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a pleasure to welcome you here for a special meeting at the Diplomatic Academy. And please welcome with me our speaker and guest of honor, His Excellency Mohammad Sanusi Barkindo. Welcome. This is a public lecture, and at the same time, it is for students of the Diplomatic Academy. So please allow me, after the introduction and the lecture of Mr. Barkindo, to give the floor first for questions to our students who are in my course on current issues. I do understand talking about OPEC is always about current issues. It's an old institution, more than 60 years already, almost 60 years of it in Vienna. And it's always powerful. That's our impression that we have. It's powerful because it's one of the longest cartels which are allowed to act globally with so many countries. And it's such a success that one could say we've got problems right now when we look at energy prices for our households in Europe and around the globe, and that is partly also due to decisions by OPEC and by OPEC Plus, which brings us at the moment, I think, to a Brent crude oil price of something like $89 US, which was not thought to be possible a few years ago when the prices were very low. Talking about this, in the next 90 minutes with Mr. Barkindo will give us an intro into what he and OPEC thinks about its role in today's world and in the energy transition especially. We come to all the issues of climate change and transition also to renewables. But let me shortly introduce Mr. Barkindo. He is Nigerian. As you know, he has been educated in Nigeria. His bachelor in political science in Nigeria, later on a postgraduate diploma in petroleum economics at Oxford in the United Kingdom, and later on an MBA in finance and banking in Washington University in the United States. But from the very beginning onwards, I understand, he served his country. He served his country, Nigeria, in many different capacities regarding mining, regarding especially also petroleum, working for the government, working for state cooperation on this, and also representing Nigeria on the international arena on petroleum issues, including the COP. Also meetings, and since 2016 now he is Secretary General of the OPEC. He's in his second term, and the term ends in the summer 2022, and he will, as he told me before our meeting, he will go back to Nigeria after that. So we are much looking forward to sharing with us your views on such actually a controversial issue, as we know from COP26 at the latest, how OPEC sees its role in the energy transition, because you gave some quite strong statements in Glasgow, but not only in Glasgow, on this issue. So, Your Excellency, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Brix. I feel really very honored and privileged to be invited to participate in this very important gathering this evening. And as I told my colleagues that today, hopefully, would be qualified to be an honorary alumnus of this prestigious institution. That I have read so much about, came across so many distinguished world personalities who passed through the walls of this institution. And that partly explains why I decided to invite all of them that are available to come and join me to their alma mater. Yasmina, here, Matthew, my very good friend here, Nadia, and Heidi, I believe, as well, all passed through this very prestigious institution. I have always been very jealous of you when I meet you at meetings, because you distinguish yourselves not only in your eloquence, but in the conduct of your work. All of you have been able to carry the torch of this great institution. I think when I walked into OPEC nearly 6 years ago, and I met Stefan, he was probably the youngest staff, and I saw him very, very active, very, very articulate, very precise in his statements. And I asked Nadia, he said, what do you expect? Diplomatic Academy. So in OPEC, we are very proud of your products who are with us, and I want to thank them for joining me today to participate. This institution, one of the world's foremost, has trained generations of distinguished diplomats. We were just discussing with you, Ambassador Brix, before we came in here, mentioning names, world leaders who passed through these halls. Standing in these hallowed chambers, one cannot help but feel a sense of history, given the significance of this institution in the development of international relations, Austrian and European affairs, and the evolution of multilateral institutions over the past 3.5 centuries or so. The Academy has fostered strong relations with the community of international organizations in Vienna, including our own organization, OPEC. These bonds have been an important component in the regular liaison between OPEC and Austria's Ministry of International and European Affairs. Indeed, there are many ways in which the history of the Vienna School of International Relations and OPEC intersect. It is not without significance that the forerunner to the Diplomatic Academy was the Oriental Academy, founded by Empress Maria Theresa in 1754. Its purpose was to train young diplomats who represented the Habsburg Empire in the so-called Oriental languages, many of which are the national languages of our member countries today. However, it was in the 60s that it became more apparent how the destinies of the Academy and OPEC were intertwined. Just 200 meters from where I am currently is the Mollwartsplatz 5. This was the first ever home for the OPEC Secretariat. When the organization moved to Vienna in the year 1965. OPEC resided in these premises between 1st of September 1965 and 31st January 1967. In fact, it was almost exactly 55 years ago we moved to the university's string, number 10, in the 1st district, where we will stay for 10 years. In 1977, we moved to Obere Donatraza, 93, in the 2nd district, and stayed there until 2010, when we moved to our current premises back in the 1st district. But let us return to 1965, Your Excellency, for a moment. For not only was this the year OPEC moved to Vienna, it was also a significant year in the history of the Academy. On the 11th of January 1965, following extensive repairs, the consular wing of the Theracianum, which had been damaged during the Second World War, welcomed the first contingent of students in the diploma program in the Diplomatic Academy of Vienna. Austria's then foreign minister, the legendary Bruno Kreisky, had signed the document establishing the new Diplomatic Academy on the 1st of June 1964. Bruno Kreisky would also sign on the 1st of September 1965 the headquarters agreement between Austria and OPEC, along with OPEC's then Secretary General, Dr. Ashraf Lutfi. Therefore, Kreisky played an important role in our respective histories, and I'm delighted to note the Academy has named the Bruno Kreisky Saal in his honor, for we at OPEC feel as indebted to him as you do here at the Academy. For we must consider the historical context of those fateful months, from the Academy welcoming its first students in January 1965 to OPEC deciding to move to Vienna in April 1965. Back then, this city, this beautiful city, the energy industry and our member countries were very different to how they are now. Vienna was not OPEC's first home. The move here occurred in the 5th year of our existence, between the 10th and the 14th of September 1960. The representatives from 5 courageous oil-producing countries converged on Al-Shab Hall in the Bab al-Mu'azzam district in Baghdad, Iraq. They were Dr. Fuad Rouhani of Iran, Dr. Talat al-Shaibani of Iraq, Ahmed Sayyid Omar of Kuwait, Abdullah al-Tariki of Saudi Arabia, and Juan Pablo Perez Alfonso of Venezuela. As a result of the actions of these 5 founding fathers, visionary leaders of our member countries, our organization, OPEC, came into existence. The petroleum industry at that time is unrecognizable to what it is today. It was dominated by the West's major international oil companies, the IOCs of the day, known collectively as the Seven Sisters, and comprising of Exxon, Texaco, Standard Oil of California, Mobil Oil, Gulf Oil, Royal Dutch Shell, and British Petroleum. By the mid-1950s, the oil majors were in control of more than 90% of production, refining, and marketing facilities in non-centrally planned economy world outside the United States. Simply put, Your Excellency, this was a time of empires and colonies and imperial preconceptions and attitudes. And the concept of developing countries like ours exercising sovereignty over their natural resources was way years out. The UN General Assembly would not pass the resolution on permanent sovereignty over natural resources until December 1962. Furthermore, should a host country attempt to assert its authority, the major oil companies and their political backers reacted, to put it mildly, unfriendly. The majors would often just move production, switching sources of crude supply at will in the event of any conflict with an individual host government. The founders saw OPEC as a platform for regular consultation among its members with a view to coordinating and unifying the policies of the members and determining among other matters, the attitude which members should adopt whenever challenging market circumstances have arisen. As the resolutions of the first OPEC conference put it, this was in September of 1960 in Baghdad. In its early years, the odds were stacked heavily against our organization, OPEC. It was a small group, it's still a small group of developing countries trying to assert our legitimate rights against the mighty Seven Sisters, who had the backing of their own host countries. This included many superpowers and global powers of the time. What the organization represented was unprecedented, and for OPEC to have any chance of remotely achieving its goals, it would need to utilize every mechanism at its disposal. As the Swiss historian Fabian Trinkler has written once, and Fabian said, one major channel in order to achieve this ambitious goal was the ability to gain observatory status in multilateral bodies, preferably influential ones within the UN system or the Oil Committee of the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, OECD. In 1960-61, one city was ideally placed as a potential location for the OPEC Secretariat to fulfill this criteria: Geneva in neutral Switzerland. Host city of the League of Nations between the world wars, Geneva was in 1960 one of the two main headquarters of the United Nations. It was also the city where the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade was signed on the 30th of October 1947, and it would become the headquarters of the UNCTAD, the UN Conference on Trade and Development. Participation in such committees within the multilateral system for an aspiring intergovernmental organization was dependent on having a headquarters agreement with the relevant host country, thereby conferring the organization with an appropriate level of legitimacy and, crucially, the accompanying immunities and diplomatic privileges. The pursuit of such an agreement remained very high in OPEC's order of business during its first 5 years. However, we faced opposition from the outset, right from the outset, and powerful interests were determined to prevent OPEC acquiring that level of necessary legitimation. As the writer Trinkler has convincingly shown through extensive analysis of British diplomatic correspondence and the Swiss Federal Archives, and I quote, at least 3 host countries of the Seven Sisters and a part of the private oil industry itself have employed a strategy of neutral non-recognition towards OPEC. The goal was to minimize the influence of OPEC by negating its official existence without expressing open hostility. Indeed, as early as 1960, Swiss officials in their correspondence with representatives from member countries and OPEC's first Secretary General, Dr. Fuad Rouhani, tried to discourage OPEC from establishing premises in Geneva, right from the outset. Despite this position at a federal level, the Canton of Geneva provided Fuad Rouhani with permission to set up an office. This seems to be due to a breakdown in communication, probably, between the Swiss Office of International Organizations and the Canton of Geneva. Faced with the reality of the situation on the ground, the Swiss policies supported by the Seven Sisters evolved into allowing OPEC to have a presence in Geneva, but maintain its informal status and not grant it a headquarters agreement. Maybe I can pause here, Your Excellency, and share with you one of the experiences of Fuad Rouhani, the first Secretary General. Rouhani was not a diplomat, probably had never gone through the walls of an academy such as this one. So I may claim to be more qualified than him to be Secretary General. When Rouhani arrived in Geneva, he decided straight to go to a real estate agent to seek for accommodation, a place he could rent for an office. You see, straight away, this is an oil man. It's a businessman, he's not a diplomat. And he went and got an office, he inspected, he liked the building by the lake, and signed an agreement and set up his signboard, OPEC headquarters in Geneva, and hired a secretary and started working. And the story went by that the mayor of the canton was taking his dog for a walk one evening, and as he was passing, he saw this signboard, OPEC headquarters. So he stood there and looked. He remembered the last time he took a walk with his dog, this signboard was not here. So it must be a new signboard. But more importantly, he didn't know the meaning of OPEP, because the signboard said OPEP, O-P-E-P. So he didn't know what it meant. So he took note, and Monday morning in the office, he called his staff and asked them if they knew anything about this company or organization or whatever it was called, OPEP. Everybody said no, we never heard of them. So he gave the address where he saw it. He asked them to go and check and to find out who is there, what are they doing, and politely invite them, if they've ever found them, to come and have tea, coffee with him. So when they went, they found our friend Rouhani, Fuad Rouhani of blessed memory, working with his secretary, and they introduced themselves and asked who he was and what was his business. He said, yeah, he's the Secretary General of the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. He just opened an office here last week. I said, okay, and where are you coming from? He said, from Iran. They just formed a new organization, and they decided the best place to come and set up shop was in Geneva. So that's why he's here. Any problem? He said, okay, our mayor would like to have a word with you, to have a tea, coffee, if you don't mind. Please, sorry to disturb you. He said, with all pleasure. He never even knew there was what Geneva was, what is the status of Geneva within the Swiss authorities. Typical oil man. So he followed them. He went to their office, and the mayor welcomed him and thanked him for coming, and told him last night he was walking his dog and he saw a beautiful signboard. So he was wondering what it was. He said, oh yeah, sorry, it's us. I said, okay, who is us? He said, we are the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. We just met in Baghdad in Iraq, 5 of us. So we formed this organization. So we decided to open our headquarters here in Geneva. So He laughed, said, "Oh, thank you very much. It's a great honor for us. We welcome you. But I am the mayor here, and you have no right to come and set up shop without coming to my office to introduce yourself, to get our permits, for you to sign agreements with us, blah, 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 blah." So the rest is history. So the first outing in Geneva, Fuad Rouhani ran into this difficulty. But because of our background, oil people sometimes cannot be as diplomatic as the alumni of this prestigious college. So for our first 5 years, we were struggling to secure recognition, a headquarters agreement, and also diplomatic privileges and immunities, the necessary legal protections for any international organization. So I want to use this opportunity, Your Excellency, to debunk the stories in the media of that time, in case some of your students in your libraries found some of these narratives, that one of the reasons why we fled from Geneva to Vienna, because the authorities there could not give our staff duty-free whiskeys and cognac, especially in winter. So this is not correct, but this is what the media reported, I think, when we moved from Geneva. Now, over here in Switzerland's Nachbarland, Austria was trying to carve out an image and role for itself following the traumas of the first half of the 20th century. On the 26th of October 1955, the Austrian parliament here issued its declaration of neutrality as a constitutional act of parliament that became embedded in the Austrian constitution till date. Over time, permanent neutrality also became an integral part of Austrian national identity. Thereafter, successive Austrian governments sought to promote the image of Austria, particularly this great city of Vienna, as an international hub, a meeting point between East and West, the premier venue for major international events, and the seat of international organizations. A first tentative step in this regard came in October 1957, when the delegates to the first General Conference of the International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, decided to establish the IAEA's headquarters here in Vienna. The rehabilitation of Austria's image as an international hub gained further momentum with the summit between the Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev and the newly elected US President Jeff Kennedy on the 3rd and the 4th of June 1961. The significance of this meeting cannot be overstated, Your Excellency. As the historian Eric Frey has written, the summit was the crucible for the country's ambition to become an international meeting place. By 1965, the project to further consolidate Vienna's credentials as an international center was full steam ahead. It was also a particular priority for the legendary foreign minister Bruno Kreisky. With OPEC in need of a headquarters agreement, Austria and OPEC were perfect partners. The timing was extremely propitious. In April 1965, OPEC decided to move its secretariat to Vienna. On 1st of September 1965, Bruno Kreisky and Ashraf Lutfi signed the agreement between the government of Austria and OPEC. That same month, OPEC became only the second international organization after the IEA to establish itself in this great city. Remarkably today, that number has ballooned to over 40 international organizations that are proud to call Vienna home. For OPEC, the decision to move to Vienna proved a judicious one. The organization obtained an immense level of legitimacy through its headquarters agreement with Austria. Almost immediately, OPEC became more involved with the UN through the Economic and Social Council, ECOSOC, and UNCTAD. OPEC formalized relations with the ECOSOC under Resolution 1053, adopted on the 30th of July 1965. OPEC also became intensively involved with UNCTAD after 1965. I have spoken at length, Your Excellency, about this move to underscore just how special OPEC considers its relationship with our beloved host country, Austria. International organizations whose membership was composed exclusively of developing countries were few and far between in 1965, but Vienna respected us enough to let us move here and call Vienna our home. This was long before the UNO city was built in the 22nd district. With OPEC, Vienna had a second home, and more were to follow in our footsteps. This has been a mutually beneficial relationship and has allowed OPEC to concentrate on its primary function, contributing to stability in the oil market in the interest of producers, consumers, and the global economy alike. Let me underscore that we are proud of our friendship with the city of Vienna, with Austria, proud of our role in the multilateral system and the international energy community. This friendship has been sustained and fostered by successive generations of Austrian diplomats, the majority of whom honed their skills and trained here in this historic great institution, the Diplomatic Academy. One final word on Geneva, Your Excellency. Subsequently, OPEC has developed very warm relations with Geneva, and the city has hosted many meetings of the OPEC conference. I can attest to this from personal experience. The first meeting of the OPEC conference that I ever attended was back in March 1986 as part of the Nigerian delegation. This was the 77th meeting of the OPEC conference. I, along with many representatives from OPEC, have tremendous affection for the city of Geneva. Your Excellency, distinguished colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, allow me now to turn from the challenges of the past to the great challenges of our present and indeed our future. I refer, of course, to the issues of climate change and sustainable development. This is an existential issue that affects every person on this planet. At the outset, permit me to stress a point. There are no climate change deniers at OPEC. None whatsoever. As an intergovernmental organization composed exclusively of developing countries, our member countries will be among the worst impacted by climate change. The organization has a long history of supporting environmental issues and sustainable development, with the declaration of the third summit of heads of states and governments of OPEC member countries in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, Riyadh, in 2007. recognizing not only the importance of stability of global energy markets, but the need to utilize energy for sustainable development and energy and the environment, putting OPEC well ahead of its time. OPEC and our member countries have also been directly involved in the evolution of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, whose core elements, particularly equity, historical responsibility, and national circumstances, must remain central to all processes moving forward. The organization has been there every step of the way, from the UN Intergovernmental Negotiating Committee in 1990, which produced the Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is the Bible of climate, if you like, to the Rio Earth Summit in 1992, from the first conference of the parties COP1 to the UNFCCC in Berlin in 1995, ably led by a very young lady you might remember, called Angela Merkel, who was probably the youngest environment minister of unified Germany, to the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, and the Paris Agreement in 2015, to COP26 that you made reference to in Glasgow last year. We are also delighted that COP28 will be hosted by our member country, the United Arab Emirates, in 2023. Excellency, there is also a misconception that we are anti-renewable. This could not be further from the truth. Many of our member countries, if not all, have and are investing heavily in renewable sources of energy, particularly wind and solar. Rather, let me tell you what OPEC supports. OPEC supports the science. OPEC is pro-data driven in analysis. OPEC is pro-multilateralism. OPEC believes that a challenge of this scope requires a comprehensive solution. There is no silver bullet or panacea that can solve the climate issue on its own. No one should be left behind. All voices need to be heard and listened to. We all share this planet, Your Excellency. We need multilateralism at the center of our energy, climate, and sustainable development future. This is not a race to renewables alone. Rather, it is a race to reduce greenhouse gases, and in doing so, use energy more efficiently. That is the challenge before us. The oil and gas industry can foster its resources and expertise and help unlock our emissions-free future through its role as a powerful innovator in developing cleaner and more efficient technological solutions to help reduce emissions. An example of this is the carbon capture, utilization, and storage technologies, as well as the promotion of the circular carbon economy to improve overall environmental performance, which has been promoted by our member country, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and received a positive endorsement from the G20. We need to continually highlight the importance of environmentally and economically effective policies that are equitable and just, as well as fair and inclusive strategies that ensures no one is left behind. We must be all inclusive. The capacities and national circumstances of developing countries must be taken into account in all actions. In order to not render countries already struggling even more besieged, it is necessary to carefully consider the adverse socio-economic impacts on these countries due to mitigation activities in order to identify remediation measures and share best practices. Furthermore, we should never forget that climate change and sustainable development are two sides of the same coin. The scourge of energy poverty continues to blight millions on our planet. According to the UN, 759 million people do not have access to electricity that we take for granted here in Vienna. 759 million people. 1/3 of the world's population use dangerous or inefficient cooking systems, which causes a host of health-related problems. For this reason, Sustainable Development Goal number 7 calls on the international community to work towards ensuring sustainable access to affordable, reliable, sustainable, and modern energy for all. To be precise, Your Excellency, the latest numbers show that about 2.8 billion people in this world have no access to clean cooking fuels for making breakfast, lunch, and dinner. Nearly 2.8 billion people. Allow me to mention here our sister organization, the Opec Fund, which has provided billions of dollars over the last 46 years of its operations to address development challenges and energy poverty. Since the establishment of the Opec Fund in 1976, it has committed more than $22 billion to development projects in over 125 countries, with an estimated total project cost of about $187 billion under the vision of a world where sustainable development is a reality for all. Policymakers therefore need to be cognizant that even the best intentioned policies can have unintended consequences, and the issue of sustainable development requires due attention. This is particularly pertinent when one considers the future trajectory of the energy industry. According to our World Oil Outlook, our flagship publication, which looks at the longer term, projections for the industry, the global economy in 2045 will be more than double the size it was in 2020. More than double. The global population is expected to reach 9.5 billion people by 2045. Our analysis correlates with other similar reporting agencies. As a result of these demographic and economic changes, global energy demand is set to increase from 275 million barrels of oil equivalent a day in 2020 to 352 million barrels of oil equivalent per day by 2045. No single source of energy can meet this demand growth alone. None. Demand for other renewables, combining mainly solar, wind, and geothermal energy, represent the single largest incremental contribution to the future energy mix, rising from 6.8 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2020 to close to 36.6 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2045. Moreover, it is also the fastest growing energy source within its share in the global primary energy mix. This means renewables' share of the energy mix is predicted to rise from 2.5% in 2020 to 10% in 2045. Clearly, multiple forms of energy are required to meet this rise in demand. Oil is forecast to remain the fuel with the largest share of the global energy mix until 2045. Primary oil demand is set to increase in the long term from 83 million barrels of oil per day equivalent in 2020 to 99 million barrels of oil equivalent per day in 2045. In 2020, oil accounted for about 30% of the global energy requirements. By 2045, it is expected to account for approximately 28%. Oil and gas together are still expected to account for more than 50% in this time horizon. Now, despite these trends, there are some who argue that the oil and gas industry should be consigned to history, and that the future is one that can be dominated exclusively by renewables and electric vehicles. This has impacted the investment climate, and we need to be cognizant of how oil and gas industry investments are being impacted by environmental social governance requirements, ESGs, and the climate disclosure drive from the financial community. We are concerned about the ESG footprint and stranded asset risk to our industry. The environmental aspect of ESG is perhaps outweighing the need to address the social and development issues. We need to work with all industry stakeholders to ensure an investment-friendly climate, one that is sustainable and works for producers and consumers. We need to avoid the serious market volatility that could result from underinvestment. Investments, my dear friends, are the lifeblood of our industry. Cumulative oil-related investment requirements amount to $11.8 trillion in the 2021-2045 period. Of this, 80% or $9.2 trillion is required in the upstream, with another 1.5 trillion and 1.1 trillion needed in the downstream and the midstream respectively. Improving the investment climate is therefore one of the priorities of our organization and has underpinned our recent cooperation with the 10 non-OPEC oil-producing countries led by the Russian Federation under the framework of the Declaration of Cooperation in the past 5 years. A novel and innovative concept, this framework, the Declaration of Cooperation, is a platform whereby OPEC and the 10 other non-OPEC oil-producing countries come together to take collective decisions and implement them collectively and monitor the implementation together to help mitigate severe and destructive volatility in the oil market. It was signed on the 10th of December 2016, and we have continued to implement it till date. It has helped the industry recover from 2 severe downturns: the supply-driven downturn of 2014 to 2016, and the pandemic-caused downturn in 2020. In supporting the industry at this hour of need, a contribution has been made to the global economic upswing in 2017-2018 and the recovery from the COVID-19 pandemic. My dear friends, my final point is one that can often get overlooked in the passionate exchanges in public discourse on energy transition. Oil, petroleum, and petroleum products are so integral to our lives, but we often take them for granted. This sentiment has been elegantly expressed by the author Mike Patrick Smith in his memoir on his time working as an oil hand in the Bakken oil fields in North Dakota. Patrick said, "It is strange to think of industry containing magic, but even in our current age of reason, it is hard not to think of oil as containing properties that although also destructive, can only be described as utterly fantastic. Oil refined into gasoline, diesel, jet fuel, makes cars drive, planes fly, and ships sail. It powers submarines and spacecraft, sends shellfish to Colorado, medicine to Liberia, and supplies to war zones across the world. It powers our school buses, our gunships, ambulances, and tanks. But it does more than transport us. It heats our homes. It illuminates our nights. We eat off it. Petroleum is contained in the glaze on our china, the finish on our tables, the linoleum on our counters, the tile on our floors. It wraps around us in the fabric that clothes our bodies, in the jewelry that adorns our necks and hands and fingers, in the balm that soothes our cracked lips, in the makeup that defines the contours of our faces. And it is inside of us, the syringes and the pills that deliver medicine into our systems and are made from petroleum, including vaccines. Synthetic ammonia, derived from a process using refined oil, is an essential ingredient in fertilizer. Without it, farming on an industrial scale would not be possible. It is in our food. We eat it. Oil is so prevalent in every aspect of our existence that it has become all but invisible to the vast majority of people who need it simply to live. How apt, Patrick. When you listen to any OPEC official speak, if you read any of our publications, statements, or press releases in the past 62 years of our existence, if you examine our statute, you will see our core objective repeated over and over and over again. Oil market stability on a sustainable basis. This goal drives all of our activities, all our actions, and almost all our research. OPEC does not seek stability for stability's sake. Rather, we are acutely conscious of the broader social and economic benefits for all which come as a result of sustainable oil market stability. We recognize just how essential our commodity is in the daily lives of billions of people. A secure and stable supply of oil fuels growth and makes life that bit easier for consumers and producers. In 1965, when we moved to this great city of Vienna, as proud neighbors of this esteemed diplomatic academy, nobody could have foreseen the twists and turns that the subsequent course of history, international relations, energy developments, and geopolitics would take. And yet, at its core, the relationship between Austria and OPEC was rooted in a recognition that multilateralism, dialogue, respect among nations, and cooperations in the energy sphere could lead to a better and fairer world. The work is not yet complete, my friends. That's why I would like to conclude my remarks with an appeal to the younger generation, the students listening to me in this room and online. Our industry, the oil and gas industry, needs you. Do not rule out a career in this industry. We need your talent, your know-how, your savviness to deliver our commodity to billions of hardworking people throughout the world. Ours is not just an industry of engineers and geologists. There are career possibilities for lawyers, for economists, for creative individuals, PR specialists, possibilities for those who study marketing, graphic design, linguists, literally countless possibilities. Of course, we want to improve our industry's environmental credentials, improve energy efficiency, but oil cannot be wished out of people's lives. Ostracism and exclusion of industries are not solutions to the climate challenge. Rather, we need to work together in the interest of our children and our children's children. Finally, when students graduate from this diplomatic academy, I am told by these distinguished alumni who are now paying their dues in Opec that you sing the traditional academic song, Gaudimus Egota. Allow me to finish by paying tribute to this auspicious academy, this profound center of global learning that continues to shape our world by repeating the enduring words from that great song. Viva Academia, viva professors, viva membrum quodlibet, viva membra qualibet, semper stint in flore. Danken, Prof. Danken, danken, danken.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for this brilliant presentation that there is no end nigh for oil in this world, and for also bringing it together with the history of the Diplomatic Academy. I couldn't have done it like that, like you did it. This is a meeting where we ask our students also to ask questions. So I've opened the floor actually to challenge the issues you heard. Mr. Barkindo wants to change the narrative from the narrative oil against renewables to a narrative we need the oil and we will need the oil also in the future in our energy mix. Maybe you want to challenge it, you want to support this. So the floor is open.
Thank you very much for your presentation. You have mentioned the inability of getting away from oil, and that OPEC is also investing very much into furthering new technologies. Is there actually also research going on how to find a substitute for use of oil in many productions where it is today seemed as necessary? Is there something that OPEC is working on how to find substitutes in some fields?
Thank you very much. A very important question. First of all, I want to once again state categorically clear that the narrative, unfortunately, gaining currency, that the energy transition as a result of the climate crisis is a transition from oil and gas or from fossil fuels to renewables is totally distorting the facts, is misrepresenting the science, and hence probably your question, whether there is research or efforts that are ongoing to find replacement for oil. I just shared with you what the data says. This is not an opinion. This is the data. That oil and gas will continue to dominate the global energy mix for the foreseeable future. And secondly, no one single source or group of energy sources that can replace oil and gas. Thirdly, what the science tells us, both the UNFCCC, which is the Bible of climate, ably supported by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, IPCC, which is populated by academics like yourself, is that the challenge before us is how to address and contain greenhouse gases, emissions that come from the exploration, from the production, from the processing, transportation, marketing, and consumption of fossil fuels. It is not a race to substitute them. It is a race to apply technology to contain the emissions of carbon that come from these sources. And here I must commend the scientific community, the international community that are trying hard to be able to deploy resources in this regard. Don't be convinced by anyone that for us to address the climate crisis, we need to switch off some sources of energy. This is totally misleading because, again, the science does not support that. The facts, the data do not support that either. These are narratives that are driven mainly by emotions rather than the facts. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency, for visiting us and giving us this great opportunity. I would like to refer to the recent news that the inflation in the Eurozone just reached 5.1%, I think, and experts say that this inflation is driven partly by energy prices, also oil prices. It's not just an economic problem; it also leads to domestic or political problems in countries. Like, for example, my home country, Hungary, even fixed gasoline consumer prices in order to curb inflation. Do you see a solution to handle this problem in the future, maybe in a partnership or in cooperation between OPEC and the major industrial countries, so to say, because this is rather, I guess, a pressing issue. I think also an issue for the oil or petroleum exporting countries as well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Very good question. Here, I would like us to step back, take a step one or two back. Between 2014 and 2016, the world went into an oil cycle that was driven by oversupply, that raised inventories to unprecedented levels, and prices crashed. With the crash of prices, we saw for 2 consecutive years, 2015, 2016, investments in this industry, which I refer to as the lifeblood of the industry, contracted for 2 years, 27%. These were of historic significance because it had never happened in history then. It had never happened. For 2 consecutive years, they did not rise, they did not stay flat, but they crashed by 27%. Time will not allow us to go into the huge implications of that. Now, we managed to craft the framework of the Declaration of Cooperation with our non-OPEC partners. We started to implement in 2017, and we saw the market responded positively. The global economy also responded positively, and we were satisfied that we were on a rebound on a sustainable basis until COVID struck in 2020. We had not recovered from the contraction in investments for 2 years. We had not fully recovered. And then 2020, this virus struck. In 2020 alone, we saw 30% investment contraction. It kept flat in 2021, and we are still where we are. And don't forget, the crisis we faced, or we are facing, is a health crisis as a result of a virus. The virus that has engulfed the whole world. And the global economy, the oil market, and the industry are all responding to development within the health sector, with vaccines being made available. Global populations are accessing them. Countries are opening up. Demand for oil began to rise. So also is the global economy. In 2020, we saw about 3.4 to 3.5% global GDP contraction. Huge for the whole world, huge. But in 2021, we saw a rebound in global GDP, about 5.6% or so. In 2022, we are projecting about 4.2%. Because of the correlation between GDP growth, economic growth, and the consumption for oil, demand for oil also shot up. But supply is lagging behind because of lagging investments, no investments. Because of these two cycles, but more importantly, the ESGs, the environmental sustainability and governance as a result of climate. The narrative that we were talking about, where the world is being told that to solve the global climate crisis, we have to switch off oil, we have to switch off gas, coal, and what have you. Banks should stop funding projects in this industry. In all my years in this industry, 35 plus, I cannot recall a time when this industry has this huge challenge in accessing funds from the banking and the financial community because of climate. The narrative is misleading, is distorting the science, but it's so powerful, it's so potent that it has penetrated boardrooms of companies, it has penetrated the shareholder community of companies, and has fueled the civic response on the streets with the demonstrations all over certain parts of the world. And our politicians are politicians. For them to survive, they have to win election, and they have to be re-elected. And they have to listen to all viewpoints. Therefore, yes, inflation is shooting up, not only because of energy, but because of food and almost everything. I think the last time I saw the numbers in the US, about 7%, the highest in nearly 40 years, they said. Same here in the EU. So at the end of the day, it's a function of supply and demand. But we owe it a duty, it's incumbent upon us to put the record straight to the world that this misrepresentation of facts, this distortion of the science that is driven more by emotions rather than data, rather than facts, is not in the interest of anybody, especially the youths. Especially the youths. The narrative should focus on how to contain and minimize the emission of greenhouse gases across the spectrum. Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Yes, please.
I would like to put to you two questions. As you know, the European Commission, in its taxonomy, is always speaking of nuclear and gas as transitional energy forms, but does not mention explicitly oil. I suppose that oil is included in gas, or is it not? Why don't they mention also oil explicitly? My second question is, there are a number of studies and speculations when the oil resources in the world will come to an end. What is the more or less official projection of the OPEC? Do you say in 50 years or in 100 years, or will never come to an end? So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Very important questions. Yes, it was breaking news, I think, last night or 2 nights ago when the EU decided in Brussels to reclassify gas and nuclear as green sources of energy. Now, with all due respect to the EU, the EU is our dialogue partner. We have a very important dialogue, energy dialogue that has been ongoing with the EU, which is mutually beneficial, and we continue to pursue these dialogues at both policy and technical level. We welcome pronouncements from Brussels to broaden the scope of sources of energy. However, the EU should not allow this to go too late. We are not linking this decision to the current energy crisis facing Europe. This current energy crisis is also a function of supply and demand, which is also related to the underinvestment in this sector for many, many years, including in gas. The numbers I shared with you did not only apply to oil. It's even worse for gas. In most of these countries, there's literally no investments going into even storage for this commodity to withstand the swings in market conditions. And when we saw this rebound in the European economy, we saw the correlating rebound in demand for consumption of gas as well as oil. And the lag between the two is very evident. And hence, this unfortunate situation that we have found ourselves. Just this morning, I saw the energy inflation in the EU is in the region of 28% as a result of that. I think there is need for the world to pause, to go back and look at what exactly did we agree in Paris in 2015, which was based on what? On submissions made by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. The IPCC is not a political body. It was set up as a scientific body to advise policymakers on these issues. We have seen a continuous divergence between what the science dictates through the IPCC and other bodies and the policy decisions that are being taken by policymakers in national governments and regional bodies like the EU. Until we all go back to ground zero and for a moment forget about the elections, the next elections and the elections, and listen to the science and take decisions not only for the short term, but for the medium and long term. We are likely to continue addressing this global issue, which I referred to in my remarks, that we cannot run away from a comprehensive solution. We cannot address this global challenge in bits and pieces. The redefinition of what constitutes green source of energy or what is admissible in the energy transition and not, these are negotiations by politicians, depending on the national circumstances and the proximity of elections. So we need to pause and reverse that. We are on a dangerous path going forward. The level of prices in all the energy sources, including coal, is as a result of these distortions. And of course, geopolitics. What is happening in the region, in Ukraine, has a higher premium on energy prices. It is beyond OPEC. It is beyond OPEC plus. It has nothing to do with us. Okay. Your second question? The end of oil. Thank you very much. Okay. Now, the proven, recoverable, proven reserves, underground resources, oil that has been explored and proven around the world, it's in the region of about 1.5 trillion barrels underground, even with the dearth in investments. Because even the investment capital, nowadays, we have noticed in the last 2 cycles, very little, if any, goes into exploration. Very little. So yet we have this amount of 1.5 trillion. By the second half of this year, we project that the world will return to pre-COVID consumption levels. Before COVID struck in 2020, this world was consuming about 100 million barrels every single day. Every single day, 100 million barrels. And we saw this contraction in 2020, unprecedented 2021. Now we are seeing the recovery, but we are projecting we are going back to that same level in the second half of this year. So oil will continue to be the fuel of choice. The challenge we face is how to deploy adequate resources, financial and appropriate technology to decarbonize oil, which is doable. There are technologies now that are being promoted in institutes and laboratories around the world, but they are not, in our opinion, attracting the required attention of policymakers, of the banking and finance community to fund this research. Companies are not being encouraged to even apply these technologies. So that needs to be reversed as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, please, over there.
Me, likewise, I would like to thank you very much for your talk. I was particularly struck by your story about the origins of OPEC and the 5, I believe, courageous was the word you used, as a bid for maybe more independence, or almost, if I put it like a bit bluntly, an anti-colonial or neo-anti-colonial movement. I want to say this resistance against also the Western companies which had then almost monopolies, to which extent has it influenced OPEC's policies over the years, and to which extent does it still play a role today?
Well, I'm not sure whether I got your question correctly, but if you are looking at the origins of the organization, of course, it goes without saying that the 5 founder members were all developing countries. And it may also interest you to know, among these 5 countries, one of them was still a colony when its representative sneaked to first go to Cairo in 1959 at the first Arab Petroleum Congress, where these 5 countries first got together secretly on the outskirts of Cairo to sign what they call a gentleman's agreement among them that metamorphosized into the Baghdad Conference and the Baghdad Agreement that gave birth to OPEC the following year in 1960. So yes, these are courageous, bold, but visionary developing countries or country representatives who decided it was time to exert their sovereignty over their natural resources. And of course, it was also the season of decolonization. That's correct. And we cannot deny the fact that it probably had some influence in these gentlemen getting together to decide to form this organization. And it was not uncommon at that time for these 7 sisters who were operating in these countries to take even production or pricing decisions without even any reference to these host countries. So it's a combination of many factors, if you like. But with the benefit of hindsight, now 62 years, what they did was visionary. It was timely. And it has proved the test of time. a former Secretary General once told me that if OPEC was not founded in Baghdad in 1960, probably some countries in the Western Hemisphere by now would have founded something like OPEC because of the strategic importance of the organization and the stabilizing role that this organization has played in the last 62 years. I told you probably that together with this current cycle, this COVID cycle, we have witnessed 7 cycles, 7 oil cycles, 7. And in all these 7 cycles, I think the funerals of OPEC were loudly announced that the end of OPEC had come, the funeral rites were about to begin because the world saw the changing shifts on the energy landscapes and the very high volatility that accompanied these cycles, and came to that conclusion of gloom and doom that this was the end of OPEC. But to the contrary, OPEC rose to the challenge and played its role constructively, positively, to restore stability to the market, which was what both the producers and the consumers always require. Thank you.
I think the question was also the relation to corporations, to the companies. How did it change? So who has the saying? Is it the states, member countries, or is it the companies that are working in the countries?
Thank you very much, Prof. In almost all our countries, these 7 sisters and what remain of them, some had gotten married, so they have lost their identity, through mergers and acquisitions and what have you. But they continue to operate in most of our countries, either as joint venture partners or as independents or as contracting firms under amicable contractual obligations to the benefit of both sides. And over the years, our national oil companies have also grown, developed, matured. Some of them are competitors to these international oil companies because it's about capacity at the end of the day. Some of the most successful national oil companies have gone international. They are now operating beyond the shores of their countries and competing effectively, and this is what the world needs. The industry, by and large, benefited immensely to this transformation. Thank you.
I think we can take one more question. Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you also from my side for your very interesting presentation. I have one question about climate change mitigation and OPEC, and that is burning oil.
Maybe you can take off to the
Yeah, sure. Yeah. Okay, I have one question on climate change mitigation. And in my understanding as a simple engineer, there are 2 categories of things you can do with oil. You can use it for making plastics and many other very useful things, and you can burn it, like gasoline, diesel, or any other fuel. But this is a chemical reaction, and one of the reaction products is carbon dioxide, it's CO2, which we want to avoid somehow. So, and one of these methods that you hear very often is this CCUS, carbon capture, use and storage. I would like to ask you, what future do you see with that? And the second question, do you see other methods to mitigate this CO2 emissions by burning oil?
Thank you very much. A very interesting and important question. The technology of carbon capture and sequestration has proven to be potent in the war against climate change. It has been applied, and there are many projects around the world at the moment that are applying this technology. But it is also our candid opinion that when you look at the flow of funds from the banking and the financial community to the development of this technology, to the application of the technology, it's very minimal compared to what is required. We are in regular conversation with companies, and they tell us that some of these banks and financial institutions are not even ready to give them a listening ear. Once they see a proposal from them for funding of CCUS project. Why? Because they say that their shareholders are not friendly to them management funding these projects. 2, their boards, these shareholders have also infiltrated their boards, and they are not likely to have positive response depending on the quantum of the funding that is required. And 3, civil society. They try to avoid demonstrations around their buildings because somebody, a climate activist in the bank, has tweeted or posted on Facebook or Instagram that there's a proposal XYZ on CCUS. So there are a variety of challenges. But what we are calling for is for the policymakers, the corporate chieftains who take these corporate decisions, be they the companies or the banks, to face the science. This technology is in the interest of climate. It captures carbon, it stores it safely, so it reduces the emissions. There is no reason under scientific considerations to crowd it out of funding. Now, coming out of COP26 in Glasgow in December, I can tell you that I'm not encouraged. I'm not encouraged with the response of the global community there. They have shifted their attention to net zero targets without sharing with us there in Glasgow, what is your roadmap to this net zero? How are you going to achieve it? By switching oil, by switching off gas, by switching off coal. Now we are seeing the Europeans redefining what is green and what is not green. We didn't hear that in Glasgow. We were in Glasgow with Nadia. Correct, Nadia? Yeah? So I would like to use this opportunity once again to call on reputable institutions such as the Diplomatic Academy here in Vienna to also raise its voice, because you have an informed voice, a respectable voice, a voice of gravitas. When the Diplomatic Academy speaks, they must listen to you. You have to join this conversation. You have to take your rightful place to contribute to the global conversation. It should not be left to uninformed participants who are driven, as I said for the upteenth time, mainly by emotions. Thank you.
I feel that I have to say a few sentences to what you said at the end regarding our role. Our role is to educate young people and to tell them what is reasonable, and to tell them also that this world has a problem. This world has a problem, as you know. And you clashed in Glasgow with Guterres. Because Guterres said, what did he say? Our addiction to fossil fuels is pushing humanity to the brink. We raise a stark choice: either we stop it or it stops us. That's not the language that you would like to hear from the Secretary General of the United Nations, but you have to accept that that's there. And as you said, it influences investment decisions, political decisions, civil society decisions. So it's an uphill struggle that you are fighting. There's headwind.
Every banker, every financier on Wall Street, in London, in Frankfurt, and elsewhere, that listens to the UN Secretary General making this statement will think twice before deciding to either conclude negotiations that are going to invest in offshore production in the Gulf of Guinea or in the Arabian Desert, or listening to that new proposal on CCUS because of his status. Because this is the UN Secretary General speaking, which we respectfully disagree with him, because this is not based on science. This is not based on science. And that's why we urge institutions of learning, leading institutions of learning, such as the Diplomatic Academy, to help to bring this forward. I would like him to be invited here to come and defend what he said in Glasgow one day.
I will try to take it up and invite him to talk about this. But also, as you said, the European Union spoke out in its taxonomy actually against oil, because oil was not even discussed as being part of the taxonomy.
For the first time, Your Excellency, I have been attending COP since COP1 in Berlin with Angela. She was our first president of COP1. Very brilliant, young, I think she's a chemist or a physicist, very young physicist, yeah. Her husband is chemist. He's a professor in chemistry, and she is professor in physics, yes, you are quite correct. But for the first time since COP1, this COP in Glasgow, we checked with my colleague Nadia, we haven't seen one CEO of an oil company, major oil company. I think you first noticed it, Nadia. You asked me, you said, have you noticed we have not seen any of our friends here? Nobody's here. And I sent some text messages around to some of them. What's happening? We haven't seen you here. I said, what? You are very brave. You are there. If we come, they said we are on our own. It's not safe for us to come, so we are not coming. But we wish you well. This is the first time. Now, this is not healthy, Your Excellency. This is a global conversation. And they are major stakeholders. These are the major international oil companies. Not a single one was in Glasgow.
Your Excellency, I thank you for these open words about the situation. But at the same time, my gut feeling is the power of OPEC is strengthening again because of so many contradictions in the dialogues that we have. Because it is quite obvious that it doesn't make sense to speak about gas as a transition energy and not about oil. And it's quite obvious that we are not using enough technology on carbon capture, for instance. So these sort of things we discuss also here at the Diplomatic Academy. We even have a 2 years master program on environmental technology in international affairs. And this is an arena where we can discuss it. Where we don't want to get involved is directly into politics, because we are an educational institution. But personally, I take your advice and try, at least within the European context, to make some people aware that this sort of differentiation between oil, gas, and atomic energy is not driven by reason, but it's mainly driven by political interest or any other interests. So I think on behalf of all of us, we thank you for taking this time with us. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.